If the Big 12 expands westward, does that help the new schools, Colorado included, or is that getting ahead of ourselves? This is Locked On Big 12 and Locked On Buffs.
You are Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Thursday, everybody. Welcome to Locked On Big 12 and Locked On Buffs. Thank you for making these two shows your first listen every single day. I'm Drake Toll from America's #1 Big 12 podcast, Locked On Big 12. That's Kevin Borba from Colorado's #1 podcast, Locked On Buffs. And if you hit subscribe, we get to keep our jobs. Off the riff today, Washington State, Oregon State, talks of Gonzaga even in basketball to the Big 12. Does that benefit Colorado, Arizona, and the new schools out west? We'll also hit Colorado possibly finishing last, maybe not last, but at least close to it according to these projections. And we'll end with Deion Sanders. This time next year, will he be in Boulder? Off the rip here, Kevin. Washington State, Oregon State, from guys like MHVR3, random Twitter accounts, faceless, nameless, to even guys like Greg Swaim, who are well accredited across the business. They have said, Brett McMurphy or Ross Dellinger have mentioned those two schools in conference realignment talks, primarily with the Big 12. We've gotten thoughts from Utah, from BYU, from other Western schools. For Colorado, do you want to see that addition, that reuniting? Do you want to be reunited with those two schools? The reunification of old Pac-12 foes in the Big 12.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's a very weird situation because I think as someone who loves college football, right, you want Oregon State and Washington State to not be on an island of just like, yeah, you guys were a part of the club, but now you guys aren't cool enough. Like they were basically like that friend that you grew up with that all of a sudden they got a little weird in like 8th grade and you kind of just like talk at school and now we don't talk anymore in person, right? And I think for the Big 12's sake, do they bring enough value? I don't know. For the Big 12, are you confident that you could get a Florida State, a Clemson? Because I know my guy over here, Drake Toll, has talked about Clemson, Florida State. They want to move. And basically the only landing spot for them would be the Big 12 as of right now, it seems, right? So would you risk adding Oregon State and Washington State for the sake of relationships and maybe miss out on those other two? I don't know if I'd want to do that because at the end of the day, you need big brands. And do they bring enough to the table outside of competitiveness and passionate fan bases?
Is the Big 12 regional enough for Colorado? And it's a weird question to ask when USC is playing Rutgers and Cal is playing NC State. But is the Big 12 regional enough for Colorado fans to be appeased?
Mic issues. We're just struggling today. I think the Big 12, people forget, Colorado was in the Big 12 already, right? Like they left in 2011 for the Pac-12. So
a much different Big 12, but yes, they were here.
But some of these guys some of the schools were similar, right? We had Texas Tech. Though TCU was around there somewhere, Baylor was in there. Like they had familiarity where actually TCU probably wasn't in there.
They weren't, but they would be soon. Yeah,
they would be soon though. And so there's a lot of programs that they were sort of familiar with. And I honestly think Colorado's biggest problem with the Pac-12 was they didn't fit in. So I think this is a better fit for them regardless. And I don't really know if adding schools from the Pac-12 really helps them because they weren't rivals. Like they didn't have those relationships. Like their biggest rivals were Oregon and Washington. And so Colorado was always that odd man out. And I think Colorado is sort of the new kid on the block that everyone likes, right? In the Big 12, like everyone wants a piece of beating Colorado or sort of embarrassing Deion Sanders, however you want to put it. And so Colorado has a little bit of excitement around them.
From the Mike Leach days at Washington State to Jonathan Smith at Oregon State, both those programs have seen success in the last 5+ years, maybe even more so than Colorado. Is there a threat to it if those schools are added to the Big 12 that it adds two competitors that might be in a better spot than Colorado?
I think Oregon State, you could have had a case had Jonathan Smith stayed, right? I think he had the program headed in a great direction. They were kind of a dark horse playoff contender heading into the season last year. At their current state, I would say no.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's not possible, but I do think that Colorado has a chance to ascend higher than what both of these programs I expect them to be at. Because I think right now they're at the moment basically glorified Mountain West programs. And that's not me trying to hate. It's just that's what their predicament is. And I think Colorado has a chance to sort of set themselves apart this year. But had Jonathan Smith stayed, they keep Aiden Childs or DJU and Damian Martinez, who's now in Miami. I think Oregon State would probably be better, yes. But right now, I don't know.
Yeah, they've certainly been absolutely gutted from the Big 12 perspective when it comes to the conference, and those who are listening from the Locked On Buff side. Those two schools will bring value in different ways. Washington State, from a TV viewership standpoint, one of the best in the Pac-12 over the course of the last 5 years because of the pull that they have from Pullman to Seattle. Oregon State has had success in football. There's obviously a commitment in their athletic department to winning, which is not the case for every athletic department. Arizona State, you could argue, in the last few years has neglected the football program and thus revenue. And I don't believe that either of these two schools in the Pac-12 are in that vein. I also mentioned Gonzaga earlier. I'm just going to speak for you, Kevin. No basketball only. No,
yes, it's tough.
Not what pushes people in realignment. Coming up, will Colorado finish last in football? That's what pushes realignment. This is Locked On Big 12 and Locked On Buffs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. I'm going to see Tyler Childers live in concert next week in Salt Lake City. Is that cool? Yes. Is it cool that I haven't bought my tickets yet? Also, yes. Because with Game Time, I don't need to. If I was buying it right now, I'd be way ahead of the game. With Game Time, you don't have to be. They have last-minute deals. Save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater. They have flash deals, zone deals, all-in pricing. Toggle that feature, see the all-in price, a seat view, the lowest price guaranteed, and Game Time ticket coverage is one of the most flexible, if not the most flexible customer service policy in the industry. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets or concert tickets or comedy tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, and that is guaranteed. Kevin Borba of Locked On Buffs. I've got my handy-dandy magazine here that tells me all things about the Big 12 this season. Colorado to West Virginia to Kansas, TCU, UCF. And it is Pick Six Previews, Brett Ciencia, Heisman voter, who has game graders and position graders for the Big 12. To start here, he ranks Colorado as the 11th best team in the Big 12 Conference, which, honestly, above Baylor, Cincinnati, BYU, Houston, Arizona State, seems fairly fair from my standpoint. He also includes in here, I mean, there, and I've seen many analysts say, hey, there's a doomsday button where Colorado loses to North Dakota State, Nebraska, and the wheels completely fall off. Are Deion Sanders and Colorado closer to winning the Big 12, or are they closer to losing and finishing last altogether?
Oh, that's a tricky one right there. I think in that particular scenario, I'd have to say probably losing, just because they have such a tough schedule, right? You mentioned it. Open up with North Dakota State. They've won 9 titles from 2011 to 2021. They beat Power 5 teams, or now Power 4 teams, for a living.
State.
That's what they do. Kansas State. They beat a top 15 ranked Iowa team not too long ago. They beat Minnesota. They beat Kansas, which, I mean, at the time didn't really mean much, but they did it. And so Colorado has they're very vulnerable, right? Like, you could make a case that Colorado is the biggest boomer bust team in maybe college football, because if they get off to a hot start and they go 5-0, the buzz will be as insane as it was last year when they were 3-0. But if they start off 1-2, then Colorado will be the biggest meme in college football. And I don't think that's fair necessarily, because I do think 97% of teams in college football would struggle with their opening games, right? Like North Dakota State, I would say, outside of the Texases, the Georgias, Alabamas, you give any program in the Big 12 North Dakota State to open the year, everyone's probably a little nervy, right? We're all a little nervous to take on the Bison. Like, nobody wants that game. And then Nebraska on the road is always a tough game. It's a rivalry game. It's going to be 100,000 people. Nebraska has a much better quarterback. So Colorado's vulnerable. From the perspective of your question, I do think they have a lot more leaning towards losing. But at the same time, they're the same kind of team, like boom or bust. If all things go right, they're contending for a Big 12 title. But I do think they just have such a tough schedule, and that's what worries me.
For Colorado this season, the transfer portal was huge. And Brett Ciencia of Pick Six Previews lists Dallin Hayden, a running back, to Will Shepard, wide receiver, as two guys who are all Big 12 transfer team. And then on the offensive line, Tyler Johnson, Cleo Benson. Those guys are going to be huge. Defensively, BJ Green, Sam O on the defensive line. It bulks up that unit. What I want to give you, though, we know the transfer portal is a big piece of what Deion does in Boulder. I want to give you his rankings now, with those included on the offensive side. QB unit, number 1 in the conference. Shocking, I know. The running back unit, 15th. Wide receiver, tight end, 3rd. Offensive line, 16th. So there's so much ebb and flow. Skill position, aside from running back, is there. Offensive line is not. How do you assess that assessment?
You know.
There he goes.
Dude, love the mic. Brett's a great guy. And last year we talked about Colorado extensively, and I really love all of his analysis. My question to you is Colorado's offensive line better than it was last year? Like, without looking at the rankings.
We could put you and me on the offensive line, and it would probably be better than last year's.
Right, exactly. So I think Colorado accomplished quite a bit with a horrendous offensive line. So even if their offensive line is still considered not the best in the Big 12, I still feel like they were in games. Like, they were victims of, I think it was 4 or 5 one-score games that they lost. And so I think this unit's good enough to sort of flip at least 3 of those. And so although their offensive line isn't viewed as, they're the worst in the conference based off the rankings, but I do think they'll be better. And I think the weapons are just so elite that they're going to kind of mask some of the flaws, right? And I think that's kind of, when you have the top quarterback in the conference, it does mask flaws. Like, we've seen it before. Now, how much does it mask? I don't know. Patrick Mahomes, I think his best season was like 7 wins, right? So depending on what you're looking for, Colorado will shock some people. But I do think that there's a humble or a healthy amount of, like, we got to pump the brakes on them in these rankings, right?
Let's talk defensively, Kevin. 19th in the country in return production. That's 75%. That is good. Problem is, when your return production was bad last season, you've got to reconcile with that, because the scoring defense was 124th in the country. The points per play defense, total defense was 130th. There are barely that many schools in Division I football, Division I FBS, that is. Passing defense 127th as well, rushing defense 110. Let's give you the unit rankings from Ciencia. Defensively, he says Colorado has the 16th, make it the 4th, that's 16th offensive line, 4th best defensive line, 11th best linebacking core, 12th best DB unit. That 4th best D line shows me a lot. It's going to give you more leeway for a secondary that might not be as experienced. How do you assess that assessment?
I like the defense line assessment. I think they got a guy like BJ Green, was an all Pac-12 guy last year, had 6 sacks. They took both of Pitt's best defensive linemen last year. They had, I think it was like 5 and 4 sacks respectively. Really good. I think they're going to be a lot better at stopping the run. They got Chidozie Nwankwo from Houston, who is someone undersized, but he goes by the block bully. He's there to get dirty in the trenches, to get dirty in the middle, and they're going to be more physical. And so we talked about that returning production not being good. I would say, and this goes for the offensive line too, but the defensive line specifically, all the guys that started last year, I don't expect them to start. Like, I think it's going to be a brand new unit. And so those guys just went from your key starters to depth pieces. And I think sometimes it's okay to admit that not every role is right for everyone, right? Like me and you, we're not going to be out there rushing the passer ever. That's just not us. But maybe we could find a nice little job passing out waters or something. That could be us, right? And so I think realistically, Colorado's defense line is going to be much, much better, and that could keep them in a lot of games. And the secondary rating caught me off guard. I do think it's probably a depth issue there. Whenever you have Travis Hunter, I do know he had some struggles, but you have Travis Hunter, DJ McKinney, who started at Oklahoma State. He did pretty well, I would say. And then Preston Hodge from Liberty was one of the highest graded transfers at PFF. So I do think that maybe there's a little room for a bump in the secondary. I think they could surprise some people, but it's probably more of a depth issue rather than a first-tier talent issue on the starters, I would say.
From the Big 12 perspective, you told me that Colorado is going to beat, and they don't even play all of these teams, but let's just say hypothetically that Colorado beats Baylor, Cincinnati, Arizona State, BYU, and Houston. I wouldn't be shocked. There's not one of those teams that I would say, no, they are squarely better than Colorado. If you told me Colorado could beat a Utah, beat a Kansas State, beat an Oklahoma State, I might have to push back at that point. Even UCF, I'd tie into that. Or an Iowa State, Arizona, Kansas. I think there's a pretty clear division in the Big 12 that Colorado marks. Like they're the team that, hey, anybody behind you, you've probably got a pretty solid shot at beating. Anybody in front of you, you're going to struggle with. And again, I go back to the schedule. You start off pretty tough. You're Colorado. And if you're able to build momentum early on, Nebraska, winnable, North Dakota State, winnable. I call those coin flip games. If the coin flips in your favor, if you're looking at 4-1 through your first 5, because you can certainly beat Baylor, then at that point, Colorado has momentum. They're hosting game day again. Everybody's talking about you, and you got a shot to make some noise. Coming up, Deion Sanders. Is he gone after 2024? This is Locked On Big 12, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Kevin Borba of Locked On Buffs. Is Deion Sanders gone after 2024?
It's a good question. I would say...
Wait. That I put you in a tough spot. Me, Drake Toll, host of Locked On Big 12, says that Deion Sanders will not be back past 2024. Okay. You react.
Okay. I think it's dependent. Can I give you like a he will be back if? Can I go that way?
Okay.
Because I think he will be back if Colorado lands a signature recruit, aka Julian Lewis. I think he needs a reason to be back, right? If Colorado struggles and say they finish sub 500 again, is he as motivated to come back? I don't think so. Is he going to leave for another job? A lot of people point to the NFL. He's said adamantly 1,000 times, I feel like, he does not care about coaching in the NFL because I think there's sort of a appreciation he has for being a college coach where there's sort of like a hierarchy where it's like, I am above you. And he also likes motivating young dudes. I'm not going to pretend like that's not a thing. He loves to inspire young guys. He loves to help them out. But I do think he appreciates the hierarchy. Whereas the NFL, it's like, I'm your coworker. I make more than you. Like, why are you yelling at me? And then also, it'd be interesting to see if a TV company came knocking his way, right? Like, what if ESPN Game Day is like, hey, we'd love to have you on. We're going to offer you more money. Would you turn that down? So I think if Colorado has a good season and they get a signature recruit, he will be back. I think if things get a little rocky, it wouldn't shock me if he's not there because his kids won't be there. Travis Hunter won't be there. And I just don't know if Colorado has the infrastructure to sort of turn it around because this is sort of a program that's built on succeeding now. Now, he did get transfers that have multiple years of eligibility, but it's like, if they're not working this year, what's the difference next year, right?
My dog is kicking my microphone. Now he's eating the base of it. Jeez.
That's okay.
Trying my home office.
He's a good voice.
Kevin, the if question then.
Right.
If Deion Sanders is given an opportunity to be the quarterback's coach for his son in the NFL, does he take it without question?
I'd say no. He's made it a pretty big point to sort of say he doesn't follow his kids. And I think that's kind of a stance of like, he wants to, like, that's him saying, I'm going to do my own thing when his kids leave, which I mean, TBD obviously. But I also think that's him saying that his kids are going on their own journey, right? Like, I think they followed him to Colorado. I think he wanted them to come to Colorado, obviously. But I think at some point you have to let them leave the nest. And I think that's kind of the point where it would be. Like, you can't follow them to the NFL, I would imagine. I think that'd be one of the most criticized moves ever. And then when things get rocky, I just feel like that leads to too many bad things, right? Like, what if things start to get rocky with Shador and he has to make the decision to bench him or whatever? Or what if they fire him because it's like, hey, actually, we're not seeing eye to eye. And it's like, okay, well, now you just fired your quarterback's dad. So what does that do for the franchise? So I don't think that'd be worth it. And I don't think he really wants to do that. If I'm being honest, I feel like he wants his kids to do their own thing. And he's talked about before, and I talked about it on my show yesterday with Philip Dukes of On3, he gave them the platform to create a career for themselves, excuse me. And so I think this is the time for them to be like, I'm going to cash in on the opportunity I've been given.
Talking the if game for Colorado, if Deion Sanders does leave after 2024, was it worth it? Long term, was Deion Sanders 2 years worth it?
Well, give me like an if of like how the season go, right? Like
6-6. We'll call it right down the middle.
6-6. Okay. Realistically, I think it's,
by the way, for a program that had 2 winning seasons in the last 16, like, what do you,
yeah, I mean,
all right.
That's kind of where I'm going here. That's a great point, Drake, because obviously they had the 4-2 season in 2020, and then they had the bowl game season, I think is around 2015-ish, if I'm remembering correctly off the top of my head. I think it's a success in terms of buzz, popularity, and money generated for the program. Coaching wise, it probably not, because it's obviously, unless you hire like Ed Reed or whatever other big name is out there, you're not going to hire a coach in college football that's going to generate the same amount of buzz. Like, the buzz ends with Deion Sanders. Like, this is like, if he decides to leave the program, I'd be sort of shocked to see I'd be interested to see who they replace him with. I'd be interested to see what kind of, like, no, ESPN's not going to be in Colorado for game day 3 weeks in a row, right? Like, that's just not possible. Unless they would have to be a huge name. I don't even know if there's a name in sports that really adds up to Deion Sanders, because if we think about his fame, he's a Hall of Fame football player. played in the MLB, was on the Yankees, which I feel like is a big deal in of itself, won the World Series, I believe, was a TV reality star, and then he also was an analyst for NFL Network. So he has always been on the limelight. So give me like an example of who could match that hype or that level of fame. And I don't think there's anyone out there. So if he leaves, even if they have a winning season, I think you could call it a success for the moment, but not a success for the future of the program.
Yeah, you know, guys like
it's not gonna be the same.
Trent Dilfer's done it, but nobody's breaking down Trent Dilfer's door with media cameras like they did Deion. Right. Not even close. So if you hire a guy like that, it's like, okay, cool. You got the understudy, you got a backup, you got the B-list guy when you had the A-lister of all A-listers in college football.
Yes.
But before we wrap up the show today,
is Quavo showing up for Trent Dilfer?
No, no Quavo for Trent Dilfer, probably. Lou Holtz might, though. They just like wheel in Lou Holtz. Like, oh, cool. Dorba, last week, Deion's comments to the media, I guess it was this week. It was recent. Yeah, somewhere in there. Yeah. His comments to the media, wouldn't talk to the CBS guy, hated the word bolstered, didn't know what chemistry meant. Was that just a bad day? Is Deion going off the rails a bit? What did you make of that?
I think, and this was what my show was about, excuse me, word soup here, on Tuesday. And I think there's a lot of, or Wednesday, excuse me. In terms of the media stuff, I'll break it down. The guys he didn't want to talk to, I think that's kind of what comes with being in the media. You get it as well, Drake, right? Like you and me do our jobs to the best of our ability. Like you go to Baylor, you ask Dave Aranda all the hard-hitting questions, right? Next time you go to Baylor, though, and you ask Dave Aranda the previous time, hey, do you feel like you should still be the head coach? Maybe Dave doesn't want to talk to you the next time. Mm-hmm. So when someone is writing frequently stories about why you and your program are not doing well, the coach doesn't have to talk to them. And so I've been saying this on my show. As media members, we have a responsibility to cover the program how we feel is appropriate. At the same time, we have to know that there's a chance that players and or coaches won't want to talk to us after we cover the program in the way we do. Now, for the CBS thing, I think that guy was just a casualty because of a behind the scenes sort of thing that is happening between Deion Sanders and CBS. And I'll just leave it at that. I think it's unfortunate because he didn't do anything, but it's one of those things where I think Deion Sanders is setting a precedent with that company in particular. And I think there's some sort of behind the scenes stuff that we don't know about. But yeah, I don't think it was a bad day. The chemistry thing kind of worried me because that was an approach he took last year as well. Yeah. And in his documentary on Amazon Prime, Travis Hunter talked about how difficult it was to sort of adapt to a brand new team, right? And they clearly did not have chemistry last year. And it was a little disheartening to hear that again. I was like, oh, I thought we were kind of past this. Like, hey, we don't need to like each other. Because he said that last year. He said, I played on teams where the quarterback and receiver didn't like each other and we did just fine. Which I'm sure that's true. But in college, there's a whole sense of camaraderie. It's like you are representing more than yourself. You're representing your program, your families, and in the NFL, you're there for a check. And so I would call it a mixture of Deion Sanders sort of showing the fine line of relationships between coaches and media. And then I would also call it Deion Sanders sort of not wanting to showcase any flaws in a way. Question mark?
Question mark. We'll leave it a question mark. That's Kevin Borb of Locked On Buffs. Drake Toll with you, Locked On Big 12. Come back tomorrow. We're covering all things college football as it comes up in less than 2 weeks. We get week 0. This has been and always will be Locked On. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. Buffs and Ose Grande.